So this is an image. Let me just start my clock. Hold on, sorry. This is an image that I discovered in around 2006, which is of a dust storm in Stratford, Texas, from 1935. And I became very interested in the image and spent quite some time researching it. And oops, oh, no, that's wrong. Okay, so Duststorm, Stratford, Texas, 1935, which I became interested in, mostly because of its sort of apocalyptic and cinematic appearance. I found it on the internet and decided it was an interesting image and pursued it. So it forms the basis of a body of work which was titled Animated Scene at a later date, and which occupied me from about 2005 to around 2011, and was gathered together in various different exhibitions, which I'll refer to. So Robin asked me to speak about this particular work, which references the storm, and also about the process by which I came to make portraits of what are called grow finish units, which are pig production units, computerized pig production units, on the sites that these dust storms occurred upon, sort of that exist in the aftermath of the storm. So I'm going to talk about three works: Duststorm, Dalhart, Texas, 2007, Grow Finish Unit near Elkhart, Kansas, 2008, and Lufkin near Hugo, Colorado, 2009. I'm going to be slightly badly behaved and reference one work which is a little off subject, called Exercise Djibouti, 2012 to finish. And I have exactly 18.5 minutes to do this, so I better speed ahead. Okay, so Duststorm, Stratford, Texas, 1935. I began to read around the subject of the dust storms, and particularly the Dust Bowl of the 30s and late 20s, 30s in America. So as this is not an American audience, I will do a very brief potted history of the Dust Bowl. Many of you would know it already, but I shall do it again for you. First World War, major spike in the price of corn, principally because the bread baskets of Russia had been knocked out. And you had a huge surge of power directed to the American landscape to take advantage of that rise in price of corn. Sort of hybrids and synergies unfolded. One, of course, was the internal combustion engine, which was becoming mass-produced, Ford, etc. Also, the mass exploitation of petroleum in the early 20th century come together to enable an incredible power source to be directed to the landscape. Now, between about 1920 and 1930, or maybe a little earlier, 1915, 1925, 100 million acres of the American, what's called the kind of Midwest, or the sort of panhandle area, which is Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Kansas, sort of circuit of states there. 100 million acres of that area was plowed, which means that the prairie grass was cut through with petrol-driven plows and turned over, and that to become wheat, fields for wheat. Now that process was previously unimaginable, because remember, but in 1910 you would have plowed with an ox or a horse. By 1920 you could plow with a tractor. That's a major shift, which is actually not so long ago. Anyway, coupled with a drought, a cyclical drought, a 20-year cyclical drought, the results were essentially an ecocide. The effects are still being felt on this landscape. It is to this day the worst environmental catastrophe in American history. And the 100 million acres on its peripheries were badly damaged by the drought, which blew all the dust, all the earth away, leaving just hard pan. But really, the central areas were the most chronically affected, which is where that town of Stratford is. So this is a wall of dust which has been blown by the wind. It's quite often about half a mile tall and about 1,500 miles wide, and it's essentially stripping the landscape of topsoil. And the topsoil then often would rain on the east coast of America and out to sea. But what was left behind was essentially semi-desert, where previously it had been some of the richest grasslands on Earth. So it's an example of a power surge directed to the landscape with catastrophic results at the start of the 20th century. This is the aftermath of the dust storm, etc., etc. A major human cost, and of course ecological cost to this event. A very famous image of children and a man fleeing from a dust storm. Now the response was almost as if a warlike response. You know, that the landscape made war against the human population, and they made war in turn against the landscape to try and regain control. And this is an image of dust masks which were handed out by the Red Cross to fight against dust pneumonia, which was a major peril of the dust storms. So I, after a year of reading around the subject of the dust storms, decided I would go and try and find the original of that image. I just felt compelled to sort of connect with the sort of first document of that first image I showed you, and traveled to the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History at the University of Texas at Austin, where I found the original, which you can see here. And, well, one of two originals, actually, of the same scene, two shots of the same scene. And turning it over was this interesting phrase, which is Duststorm at Stratford, Texas, April 14, 1935, 5:45 p.m., lasting 45 minutes, darkest dark I ever experienced. And I, at that time, was interested in this idea of gradients of darkness. I was working on a series called Figure Blocking Sun, which is portraits, in this case, of my partner, blocking the sun perfectly with his head to form a perfect silhouette. This is the second in the series. There's a series of 6 in total. So I was interested in this idea of gradients of darkness and the silhouette and this, I suppose, in the relationships to the infinite. So taking the reproduction of that dust storm, I decided to make a work which would look at that event. And really the proposal for myself was that I would go and try and find the site on which the original storm had traveled across. And I'd remake the storm as a kind of social structure. And I would place it, the historic storm remade within the virtual, because I do work within the virtual, which I'll talk about in a minute. But I'd place the storm on the landscape as a kind of sculpture. So I was equipped with a borrowed American SUV, a rather large one, rather greedy, petrol-greedy one, called a Suburban, and a glamorous driver, and a slightly less glamorous map reader. And we took off across Texas, 12-hour drive from Austin to Stratford. So on the way, I was really looking for this landscape, the landscape that would be the landscape of the work, the dust storm work, which I wanted to make. So we drove and drove and drove and drove for 12 hours, and on the way, of course, we come across the present usage of that landscape, which is now not so much wheat, but much more corn-based, corn being yellow corn. And these are these wonderful structures in which corn is stored on that landscape, which I was pretty taken by. And actually stopped and documented a lot of these structures, and they played into another body of work, which I'm not going to talk about. So slightly older than those type of hoppers, you've got these major wheat loading and drying points, which, funnily enough, I was following in the footsteps of Mendelssohn, who had traveled along this route in the early 20th century, and this book, Is America, had huge influence on the development of modernism, which is an aside in Europe. But so also on this landscape is what are called feedlots, where you've got cattle being raised in vast numbers. And from the air, they look a little bit like batteries, which I was also interested in. So, moving swiftly along, I found my site here as dusk fell. The next morning I got up and began to document it. As I said, I work within the virtual, so I need to make a 3-dimensional record of everything I find, because I have to build it again in 3 dimensions to go into the work. So I didn't build Mr. and Mrs. Grice. These are just the people who owned the farm that I chose. And here is their farm, which became the center of the work. There's documents from the farm. And then, taking 4,000 or 5,000 pictures, I had to begin to document everything on the landscape in 3 dimensions. So I lost a fair amount of weight that day, running around in the heat. And so these are all powered. This brings up water for the cattle that now graze this post-dust bowl environment. So again, 3-dimensional images of all these components have to be taken. Now, I didn't have an image of the storm in color, because the original images were all in black and white. So I turned again to the internet and found this image taken by an American soldier in Iraq of a dust storm bearing down on an army camp. And I also didn't have any moving image of the dust storm. But I was lucky enough to find this. Oh, I'm not plugging into the wrong part.
Look at this. Look at this. It is unreal.
I'm just going to start this for you again.
Christina, check this out. This is unreal. Look at this. Look at this. It is unreal. And we're about to get crushed. We are about to get crushed. This is about to go goodbye. Look at the vertical extent. Something out of the mummy. What are we going to do? I know. I'm about to go. 5.
So, fear and trembling on the Iraqi landscape. Now, I want to go on. Might better not go on.
How does it finish?
It just finished. Sorry, I have to come out and then come back in because my phone won't let me stop. Excuse me. Give me one moment. Okay, so this is what I call a working drawing, which is taking that Iraqi storm and placing it on the contemporary landscape. And it eventually became, and this is the Google Earth of the site, Grace Farm. So the process to make these works is I bring all that footage back to a studio in Vienna. I'm based in Dublin, but the work's made in Vienna. And we begin to hand build all these elements. We get to hand build all these structures on the landscape in 3D. And then we take the original photographs, put them on to make these sort of sculptural, photo sculptures essentially. We bring all of those into a gaming engine. We make these real-time worlds, which become the work. So we do things like we manipulate fur shaders to make the grass, etc., etc. So these are stills from the virtual world in progress. This is a portrait of that, a windmill, portrait of various different components on the landscape. And this is our first attempt at the storm, made using what's called a particle system, which is used in cinema to create explosions and the like. And this is work in progress stills. We're trying to get to this idea of the sculpture of the storm on the landscape, the existing landscape. So it eventually became the work Duststorm, Dalhousie, Texas, 2007. And it was first shown, this is a still from the work. The work is very hard to represent in these kinds of settings because the machine, the computer that produces it at about 80 frames a second. So it's very hard to represent as video, which is of course a much lower frame rate, so I'm not even going to try. This is a still from the work. This is the virtual world. It's Grace Farm. And you have a dust storm in the work, which you can see now, which sits on the landscape and unfolds. It doesn't move forward or backwards. It's a sort of sculpture on the landscape. And these works are 365-day works. They unfold over a full solar year. So the storm is consistent, but the sun orbits around it accurately. Okay, first shown in an exhibition called in Marion Goodman Gallery in New York called Equal That Is to the Real Itself. And as part of that trip, and this is another view of that exhibition, as part of the trip to New York to attend that opening, somebody told me I really needed to get to see the Judd Foundation in Marfa, Texas, which I did. And I set off about 6 months later to Marfa. And of course in Marfa you've got Judd's sort of opus, his great work, 100 Untitled Works in Milan, and which are in a military shed, an ex-military shed, which has been stripped of all artificial light. So these minimalist sculptures are lit by daylight on either side. So leaving Marfa, I guess perhaps sensitized by my exposure to the minimalist structures of Judd, I stopped when in the distance I saw this, which is a grow finish unit, which are these very uncanny structures. They're computer-controlled pick production units, which have no humans present at any of the time that I was there. They are areas in which pigs are fed, about 1,000 per shed. This is excrement, which is pumped onto the landscape behind. And I became interested in these structures. In a sense, the dust storm came and went, and the landscape is revived with usage of nitrogen, which I'll talk about in a minute, to provide this incredible dense production of protein in these factories, which are very far from what we might consider farming in a traditional sense. So I decided to, I made again 4,000 or 5,000 photographs of this environment, and here you can see the grow finish units on the corners of the radially irrigated cornfields here. Grow finish unit, effluent ponds, so you can see the logic. There's 5,000 of these facilities on this landscape. So multiply 5,000 by 1,000 by 5,000 pigs, and you kind of get the idea of how much pork is being produced on that environment. So anyway, work in progress, portrait of the pig production unit in progress, hand building all of the elements and placing photographs upon them to make, as I said, this idea of the sculptural photograph. So, and the eventual work became Grow Finish Unit, Evil, Oklahoma, 2008. I don't know what's going on there. So these are stills from the work. This is the work that restaged was in the virtual, and again with the orbit, a solar orbit built in. So I'm showing you stills from the scene and traveling around the scene. So you can see the actual finished work. This is the work at night. Sun goes down, lights come on at the start of, on the front of each of these works. And so they were all shown in 2009 in an exhibition in Venice as part of the Venice Biennale, a little bit like the Mike Nelson project that was mentioned earlier, like Pier. It was a collateral event of the Biennale, so it's a project on part of the Biennale, but not in either the Arsenale or the Giardini. So grow finish unit on a 6 meter by 5 meter projection. And here's Duststorm and another work I'm not going to refer to, which is holistic work in the background. So 3 major projections as part of the Biennale in 2009. So at that time I also published Kornbaum, A Short History of Nitrogen, which was a collaboration with Professor Michael Morris from University College Cork. I've become interested as part of my research into the American landscape and into its trajectory from being exploited and mined for corn in the early 20th century, or towards the mid-20th century, to its current relationship to nitrogen-fueled agriculture towards the end of the 20th century into the 21st. So the Kornbaum, A Short History of Nitrogen, was published in the Venice catalogue. I won't go into it because also Field Club have talked extensively about nitrogen, which we share an interest in. It has also been published by Collapse, which is the Journal of Urbanomic and Rural, if you would like to see it in their culinary materialism publication. Okay, I'm going to have to speed up because I only have about 4 minutes left. Do I have 4 minutes left? I have 5 minutes, okay. So also, as part of this series, with the umbrella title Animated Scene, I began to look at the remnants of the oil industry on that landscape. You've got these very lonely, very massive oil pumps on the Texan landscape particularly, which are very isolated, and they're drawing up the reserves that are left on that landscape. So this is my partner again, standing rather transfixed by an enormous zoomorphic oil pump. And it, again, bring home the pictures, spent about 6 months. Each piece normally takes about 6 months to make, so spent a lot of time making a portrait of that structure. This is the work in progress, stills from the 3D world. And it became a work titled Lufkin near Hugo, Colorado, 2009, which was shown as a projection in Thomas Dane Gallery in London in 2011. And here you can see it installed in the gallery alongside South Farm, which is part. I often work in series, so this is a South Farm, a part of the wider Grow Finish series, and that's the oil pump. Oil pumps are part of a wider series of portraits of oil pumps. This is Lufkin installed on a larger scale in Perth Institute of Contemporary Art. This is another of the oil pumps called Century, which is in a gallery in New York, which ended up in the Hirshhorn in Washington, along with the Duststorm. So just to contextualize the installations of the work and how they sort of interlock as part of the Animated Scene series, different sections of the Animated Scene series. Finally, this is Void Gallery in Derry, showing Universal, which is a pair of oil pumps on the Canadian landscape. Now, it's called Universal because that's the name of the company that produced it. That's what's written on, as is Lufkin. All these names are the names of the companies that own these oil pumps. Okay, so into the final straight. And it's a slightly off subject, but not absolutely. So, you know, following that narrative of the great power surge of oil at the start of the 20th century, and then I suppose following it through towards the early 21st century, where you've got the American army pursuing the resources of the Middle East, and they're staging in Djibouti. There's a major American army base in Djibouti, below Ethiopia. And again, wandering around on the internet, I found this image of what's called a mass casualty exercise in Djibouti. And this is a camouflage smoke, and this is 2 helicopters bringing in participants of this military exercise. And as part of that same exercise, you've got this wonderful, worthy of Beckett image of soldiers staging on a mudflat in Djibouti for an exercise. And so, you know, obviously the technology that I'm using, simulation, comes from the military. It comes from these kind of environments. This is a tank, and it's a simulation of a tank in, you know, an American facility on the American landscape, and people have been trained, you know, how to use this piece of equipment. And I'm piggybacking on that technology and also drawing in techniques from the video gaming world. This is how the works are made. So in a sense, kind of tracking back that narrative, and also the mechanisms by which drones are driven is again overlapping with gaming technologies. So these are all very pertinent forms of reality these days. So I'm just going to pause this for a minute. So to finish, I'm just going to briefly bring you from the American landscape, as I said, early 20th century, and to the African landscape, where the pursuit of the last vestiges of oil is occurring, and also into these strange hybrid places where the virtual becomes a kind of a folk art. And this is a video made by a member of the public using a piece of a gaming technology called ARMA, which is a commercial game also used by armies to make simulations and to make battlefield training simulations. But this strange document is put together as a piece, I guess, of folk art, essentially. I'm just going to play it for you. So, bringing these syntheses together, I'd like to point out that ARMA was actually, a piece of footage from ARMA was confused by ITV to be real and put into a newscast about the IRA, rather scandalously, last year. But all these things come together into this work, Exercise Djibouti 2012, which will be shown in Oxford this summer, commissioned by Modern Art Oxford. And it will be a sort of an infinite performance on the Djibouti landscape. I suppose looking at those sort of dynamics into the 21st century of the pursuit and mining of energy from beneath the earth. And we shall leave it at that. Thank you very much.